The founder's greatest villain was Julius Caesar. In 1764, James Otis called Caesar the destroyer of the Roman glory and grandeur at a time when, but for him and his adherents, both might have been rendered immortal. In a famous part of Patrick Henry's Stamp Act speech of 1765, which is considered genuine by Henry's biographer, Robert Douthat Mead, Henry even compared George III with Caesar, declaring, "Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III, cries of treason, may profit by their example." During the early Republican period, both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson compared Alexander Hamilton with Julius Caesar. Adams wrote, "When Burr shot Hamilton, it was not Brutus killing Caesar in the Senate House, but it was killing him before he passed the Rubicon." Adams compared Caesar's and Augustus's exploitation of the first and second triumvirates with Hamilton's tactics, noting that their intrigues and cabals have analogy enough with Hamilton's scheme to get rid of Washington, Adams, Jay, and Jefferson and monopolize all power to himself. In 1811, Jefferson told the story that at a party he had hosted while Secretary of State in 1791, Hamilton had inquired into the identity of the three men portrayed in Jefferson's wall paintings. When Jefferson replied that they were, quote, "the three greatest men the world had ever produced, Isaac Newton, Francis Bacon, and John Locke," there had been a pause. Hamilton had then declared, quote, "the greatest man that ever lived was Julius Caesar." Jefferson considered this story highly significant. While Jefferson, a true Republican, modeled himself after men of learning, Hamilton, a secret monarchist, modeled himself after a military figure who had done more than anyone else to corrupt and overturn the illustrious Roman Republic. There's only one problem with that. Jefferson's the only one who remembered this, and it's 20 years later. The evidence indicates that either Jefferson misunderstood Hamilton or Hamilton was playing a joke on the humorless Virginian. And there's some evidence for that. Jefferson had no sense of humor. The story is told that the reason why they had Jefferson write the Declaration of Independence instead of Ben Franklin was they were afraid Franklin would insert a joke in there. And they knew for a fact Jefferson would never insert a joke in. How do we know this? Well, all of Hamilton's references to Caesar in his own papers, in his correspondence, for instance, but also his private papers, were negative. They're all negative, except for one case, which was a neutral reference to Caesar's military skill. So there's no evidence that Hamilton idolized Caesar, none at all. In fact, Hamilton was well aware that his detractors compared him with Caesar, but he considered his opponents more deserving of the name. As early as 1779, during the Revolutionary War, after remarking to his friend John Laurens that Henry Lee, that's Robert E. Lee's father, was an officer of great capacity, but he said he had a little spice of the Julius Caesar or Cromwell in him, Hamilton declared in a postscript to the letter, "Apropos, speaking of a Caesar and a Cromwell, the cabal have reported that I declared in a public house in Philadelphia that it was high time for the people to rise, join General Washington, and turn Congress out of doors. But you who know my sentiments will know how to join me in despising these miserable detractors." In fact, in a 1792 letter to Washington defending his plan for funding the national debt at face value, Hamilton declared, it has been aptly observed that Cato was the Tory, Caesar the Whig of his day. The former frequently resisted, the latter always flattered the follies of the people. Yet the former perished with the Republic, while the latter destroyed it. No popular government was ever without its Catalines and its Caesars. These are its true enemies. In the next month, Hamilton publicized this charge in the Philadelphia Gazette of the United States, calling the Democratic Republicans, the party of Jefferson and Madison, quote, the Catalines and the Caesars of the community, a description of men to be found in every republic, who, leading the dance to the tune of liberty without law, endeavor to intoxicate the people with delicious but poisonous draughts, to render them the easier victims of their rapacious ambition. Hamilton signed this essay Catullus, after the famous poet who was also a harsh critic of Caesar. Hamilton left no doubt as to the identity of the particular Democratic Republicans to whom he referred. In the same essay, he concluded regarding Jefferson, but there is always a first time when characters studious of artful disguises are unveiled, when the visor of stoicism is plucked from the brow of the Epicurean, when the plain garb of Quaker simplicity is stripped from the concealed voluptuary, when Caesar, coyly refusing the preferred diadem, is seen to be Caesar rejecting the trappings but tenaciously grasping the substance of imperial domination. 3 days earlier, Hamilton had declared, in a word, if we have an embryo Caesar in the United States, it's Burr. So prevalent was the founders' fear of conspiracies against liberty, a fear derived largely from their lifelong immersion in classical political horror stories, that they could seriously equate one another, their recent partners in the struggle against British tyranny, with Caesar and Catiline. The presence of these irrational analogies in private letters and diaries suggests that they were fervent beliefs, not mere rhetorical devices. The same visceral fear of conspiracies that instilled in the founders a passionate love of liberty and a proper recognition of its fragility also fueled the tendency to see a conspiracy behind every well-intentioned blunder, a conspirator in every opponent. There was a dark side to the sense of identity and purpose that the classical authors bequeathed the founders. It required fresh threats of tyranny for sustenance. Where such threats did not exist, they must be created. And yet, in retrospect, the paranoia of the early Republican period was a small price to pay for the success of the Revolution. Above all, the classics gave the founders the courage to face the great challenges of their time. During the Revolutionary era, the classics provided an indispensable illusion of precedent for actions that were essentially unprecedented. In 1775, John Adams had been able to write regarding the popular sovereignty theory that underlay American resistance to British measures. These are what are called revolution principles. They are the principles of Aristotle and Plato, of Livy and Cicero, of Sidney, Harrington, and Locke. The principles of nature and eternal reason. In an age in which rebellion was considered an act of the darkest villainy and rebels were summarily hanged, ancient history, interwoven with British Whig and American colonial history, enabled the conservative American revolutionaries to argue that they were preserving past liberties rather than presumptuously tinkering with the natural order. Classical Republican ideology allowed them to cast King George III as Nero or Caligula, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson as Cato and Cicero. In other words, to portray the king as the real rebel, the violator of that natural law which lawful patriots would die to defend. Without this illusion of precedent, it is unlikely that the founders could have persuaded themselves and many other Americans to rebel against the mother country. The American Revolution was a paradox, a revolution fueled by tradition.